Welcome to the Philosophy of Mind. This is an overview of the readings as well as an introduction to this subject itself. The philosophy of mind could also be called the philosophy of human consciousness and the philosophy of subjectivity. These three terms refer to the same thing. Science tells us a lot about the human brain, and it can tell us a lot about human consciousness, but it can't yet tell us what it is. Neuroscience is the study of the human mind and consciousness. It's also the study of the brain and how the brain affects consciousness. And there's many things that we've learned in recent times about human consciousness. We often use terms in neuroscience like attention, which is a focus of the mind on a particular object or activity, awareness, which is a perception of conditions or events. And we've also learned that the brain is like a set of building blocks. It's composed of all these different areas that handle different things. One part of the brain may handle hand-eye coordination. Another part processes light waves. Another part processes sound waves. A different section will handle language processing and will allow the development of language skills. And yet, despite all these building blocks, consciousness is a single unified experience. You don't experience language processing or light processing separately as individual things that are different from your overall experience. These building blocks go together perfectly so that you are you. So what is this unity? What is this thing that we call the mind? We know about the different areas that process different things. What is this unity of experience that we have? Let's take a look at what the different authors that we're going to read will tell us. First, we've got Descartes and his theory of dualism. Descartes lived all the way back in the 1600s, and he really represents Europe's first attempt during the Enlightenment to define what the human mind is. He said in his writings, as he analyzed how mind is different from the body, he said that we can do things to the body we can't do to the mind. And so he concluded that the mind was a mental substance that was completely different from the physical body. So the body is physical, and we know what that means, right? But even today we don't know what the mind is. So Descartes' term was a mental substance, and he said that it was non-physical. How can a substance be non-physical? It's sort of like a logical paradox to say that. Does this mean supernatural? Does this mean a ghost, that the mind is some kind of ghost inside the body? Would some sort of quantum field, an electrical field, or something like that count as a mental substance? Of course, Descartes could not tell us about that because he can't answer that question because they didn't know about quantum fields back then. The next theory is called physicalism, and as the term suggests, it's trying to define the mind in terms of what we know about the physical world. So they cut out Descartes' claim that there's a mental substance, that there's something different than the physical world. The mind is, in fact, the brain. There's two different types of theory here. Now, there's identity theory, which simply says brain states are identical to mental states. Identical to. Now, identity is a strong term. For someone to be identical to somebody else, they would have to be the same person. You would have to clone somebody, and then you would have to raise them in exactly the same way for the original that the original person was raised, for them to be identical. It's really strong. 1 equals 1. 1 is identical to 1. 2 is identical to 2. 1 is not identical to 2. Those are two different numbers, right? So it has to be the exact same number in math for them to be identical. Likewise, a human being to be identical has to be exactly the same. So to say that brain states are identical to mental states is like saying that the brain state is in some way the mental state. but it does hold out the possibility that there's something more going on there. So it allows science to continue studying this as a separate entity. Again, you can ask whether brain energy or quantum fields would count as being identical. Imagine that consciousness was some kind of an electrical field created by the brain state. If that were the case, then you could probably say that it was identical. Now there's another theory here besides identity theory, and that's eliminativism. Eliminativism goes beyond that and says, no, forget about all these words and terms for something that's mental. That's just not the case. The brain is the brain, and the brain is the mental state. The brain is what we call mental substances, or spirit or mind or soul or consciousness, and that's all there is to it. So we know everything we need to know. The brain, therefore, can be used to eliminate the language of such things like love, hate, and things like that. Love would simply be neuron A, B, and Z firing at a certain rate, let's say 60 hertz, and being and interacting with the hypothalamus during the presence of a certain hormone, and that would be it. And so that would be what love is, and there's nothing more to say about that. There's no experience. There's no, don't even use those terms. So physicalism is not science, and I want you to realize that. Just because they use biology and neuroscience does not make them, the theory, a scientific theory. It doesn't have the answer. Instead, it offers a way of thinking about consciousness. This is why it's philosophy and not science. Physicalism says, think about water. It's two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom. At one temperature, it's ice. At another, it's steam, right? But it's always the same hydrogen and oxygen molecules. The ice and steam can be termed emergent properties. You get a bunch of water molecules together, and at a certain temperature, ice emerges from them. At another temperature, you get steam emerging from them. The same water has different properties. So maybe consciousness is an emergent property. When you get a bunch of neurons together under certain conditions, consciousness emerges. Peter Carruthers' article backs up the physicalism theory. And he gives us some reasons for believing in physicalism. One argument that he makes is that everything in the world has a physical cause. The mind is in the world, so therefore the mind must have physical causes. If you follow this theory, this argument, there can be no causation at the human level. This would suggest that there's no human freedom either, that we are caused by, all our feelings and mental states are caused by powers external to us. And so we couldn't possibly have human freedom, because that would mean that together, all these neurons put together somehow have causal power that goes beyond what any one of them has. Now this is a methodological idea. It's not a scientifically proven law. He's assuming here, as he tells us in the article, that there's a unity of all nature. And by this he means that all the scientific laws that we know must be connected. Therefore, if we believe that atoms act in causally determined ways, all higher life must as well. In other words, when scientists are analyzing atoms, and this is just one example of one level of reality, the atomic level, when they analyze atoms, the atoms are not looked upon as having free will and as deciding to go one place or another. The atoms, in fact, bounce off of each other and interact with each other based on certain physical laws that scientists have figured out through the experimental process of science. If that's the case, and these laws apply in the physical world, then they must apply to our brains as well. And if that's the case, then ultimately what gives us movement and what causes our feelings and our ideas and even the idea of us being free and making free choices is nothing other than the bouncing around of atoms at the atomic level. So at our level, the human level, we can't have any freedom. Nagel's article, What Is It Like to Be a Bat, questions this idea of physicalism. He tells us that materialists try to reduce the mental to the physical in ways that basically discount the experience. And I want you to realize when he uses the term materialist, he is referring to physicalism. Physicalism is a type of materialism. Materialism is the theory that all that there is in the world is material matter or physical objects. And it's a theory that tries to eliminate what typically has been called, the supernatural or the spiritual world. And while that's fine, it suggests that we know everything about the material world that we need to, and that's where I think philosophers start to get into big arguments. So Nagel is criticizing the materialists for just this reason. He says that he talks about how consciousness appears in different organisms, and that if an organism has consciousness, then there must be something that it is like to be that organism. And what it is like to be that organism is the subjective character of experience. In other words, if you think about your subjective experience as a human being, you think that, hey, that's me, that's myself. It counts for something. In fact, it counts for more than my body. Who I am is much more important than what the physical makeup of my body is. And Nagel's arguing that reductionism is compatible with not even having a subjective experience. In other words, subjectivity doesn't count for anything. Your experience of the world, your mind, yourself, doesn't count for anything in materialism. And that is a problem for Nagel. Nagel asks us to think about how bats create a world out of their sonar. If you don't know anything about bats, you probably still have seen pictures of bats on TV shows or movies, and they make that high-pitched squeaking sound and fly around in circles. Well, what they're doing as they fly around in circles is they are emitting a high-pitched sound that bounces off of objects and comes back to them as they circle. And they actually, in their brains, actually create an experience or a map of the world around them based on that sonar, which sounds incredible. Well, it is incredible. And Nagel reminds us that that it's very hard to try to really picture what the experience of a bat is. You can't imagine using sonar because you can only imagine it in terms of your own vision and your own hearing. Well, a bat's hearing is completely different because the entire image of the world is based on the hearing of the bat. There is no visual experience, and they can't rely upon things that they've seen to try to imagine what something else is seeing. And that would be a problem for us in trying to imagine what a bat experiences, because we'll be thinking in terms of what we've seen and not what the bat is making out of what it hears. And what it's hearing is a lot different than what we hear too, because it is listening for the closeness, the distance that it can get from the quality of the sound that bounces back to its ear. And remember, bats hunt. They eat mice and things like that. So they actually can use their sonar to figure out where a mouse is on the ground and try to catch the mouse. Nagel says some parts of reality like this are simply beyond our human imagination, and he's critical of physicalism because it seems to substitute a scientific account of the mind for the real thing.